We're going to begin our time together in the Word this morning by reflecting on Jesus' words in Matthew 10. If you could turn there with me, Matthew chapter 10, beginning in verse 16. If you've got a small black church Bible, that's page 764. Matthew 10, beginning in verse 16, page 764. A passage that will be familiar to many, where Jesus warns and prepares his disciples for the world that he's sending them into. Let's read together. Verse 16, Matthew 10. Jesus said, "Behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues, and you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them and the Gentiles. When they deliver you over, do not be anxious how you are to speak or what you are to say, for what you are to say will be given to you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for the disciple to be like his teacher, and the servant like his master. If they have called the master of the house of Beelzebub, how much more will they malign those of his household?" The same Jesus who instructed his disciples and us to love our enemies tells his disciples that he's sending them into a world full of enemies, full of people that will do them harm, sheep amongst wolves. As I mentioned last week, those in the world hate our teacher, and therefore they will hate these disciples. Those in the world, as well as believers who are still in some way conformed to the pattern of this world, will therefore do us harm. Brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and the children will rise against parents and have them put to death. We've been considering the story of Joseph together over many weeks. Joseph's brothers almost delivered him over to death, but instead Joseph was sold into slavery. But through this betrayal, Joseph would have the opportunity, as we've considered, to administrate a world-saving plan. Joseph is portrayed in the scriptures as the great manager. It's his most impactful gift, that he is discerning and wise, on a man on whom is the Spirit of God, according to the scriptures. This gifting has set him apart from his brothers, as we've seen. It's raised him to the top of Potiphar's household, then to the top of the jail. And now Joseph is managing all Egypt in a time of crisis. And we've seen on a Wednesday some of the major ways in which he has dealt with the economic crisis across two passages. We get to see the big picture of his administration of Egypt. But then, as we began to see last week, the story gets very personal again. And we see in vastly more detail how Joseph manages his own reconciliation with his brothers. And we would do well this morning to observe his actions, his thinking, and see the steps that he takes. I don't know who you think of as a good manager. In Premier League football terms, you might think of Sir Alex Ferguson. Or in the business world, you might think of Jeff Bezos. What we have this morning is an opportunity to begin to observe a Sir Alex Ferguson when he deals with a conflict between two players. Or Jeff Bezos when he handles two warring executives. We get an up-close and personal account of the emotions and the steps that Joseph goes through in his greatest managerial challenge. How to relate to his treacherous, violent brothers. We are continuing a study on forgiveness and reconciliation. And we're going to consider together the wisdom that Joseph demonstrates. We can't replicate every move that Joseph makes, but we can draw for ourselves principles of how we might manage such a situation in our lives. And so far as people hurt us, and so far as we're called to forgive them, so far as we're called to love our enemies, so far as we have opportunity to reconcile with them, we will need to be about this work. Maybe not every week, but certainly across the course of a lifetime. People will no doubt let you down and betray you. And some of those people will no doubt seek to come back into your life, rightly or wrongly. We need to learn what it means to be wise as a serpent and innocent as a dove when it comes to the difficult, scary, risky process of reconciliation. Let's reread together chapter 42 of Genesis. Chapter 42 of Genesis, page 33 in the church Bibles. Moses records for us. When Jacob learned that there was grain for sale in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another?" And he said, "Behold, I have heard that there is grain for sale in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt, but Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with his brothers, for he feared that harm might happen to him. Thus the sons of Israel came to buy among the others who came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Now Joseph was governor over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. Where do you come from?" he said. They said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." And Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. And Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them. And he said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land." They said to him, "No, my lord, your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants have never been spies." He said to them, "No, it is the nakedness of the land that you have come to see." And they said, "We are your servants, our 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is this day with our father, and one is no more." But Joseph said to them, "It is as I said to you, you are spies. By this you shall be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not go from this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you, and let him bring your brother while you remain confined, that your words may be tested, whether there is truth in you. Or else, by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies." And he put them all together in custody for 3 days. And on the third day, Joseph said to them, "Do this, and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers remain confined where you are in custody, and let the rest go and carry grain for the famine of your households, and bring your youngest brother to me. So your words will be verified, and you shall not die." And they did so. Then they said to one another, "In truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, in what we saw, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. This is why this distress has come upon us." And Reuben answered them, "Did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you did not listen, so now there comes a reckoning for his blood." They did not know that Joseph understood them, for he was an interpreter between them. For there was an interpreter between them. Then he turned away from them and wept. And he returned to them and spoke to them. And he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. And Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, and to replace every man's money in his sack, and to give them provisions for the journey. This was done for them. They loaded their donkeys in their grain and departed. And as one of them opened his sack to give his donkey fodder at the lodging place, he saw his money in the mouth of his sack. He said to his brothers, "My money has been put back. Here it is in the mouth of my sack." At this their hearts failed. They turned trembling to one another, saying, "What is this that God has done to us?" When they came to Jacob, their father, in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them, saying, "The man that the Lord of the land spoke roughly to us and took us to be spies of the land. But we said to him, 'We are honest men. We have never been spies. We are 12 brothers, sons of our father. One is no more, and the youngest is this day with our father in the land of Canaan.' Then the man, the Lord of the land, said to us, 'By this I shall know that you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers with me, and take grain for the famine of your households, and go your way. Bring your youngest brother to me. Then I shall know that you are not spies, but honest men, and I will deliver your brother to you, and you shall trade in the land.' As they emptied their sack, behold, every man's bundle of money was in his sack. And when they and their father saw their bundles of money, they were afraid. And Jacob their father said to them, 'You have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more. And now you would take Benjamin. All this has come against me.' Then Reuben said to his father, 'Kill my 2 sons if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my hands, and I will bring him back to you.' But he said, 'My son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he is the only one left. If harm should happen to him on the journey that you are to make, you would bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to Sheol.'" The Lord bless the reading of his word. That's the first movement, the first chapter in the story of the long reconciliation Joseph has with his brothers. Considering these passages, we see that there is a lot of what we might refer to in dramatic terms as plotting. It's quite a plot-heavy story. A lot of different things happen, a lot of different people with a lot of different perspectives. We're going to walk through some of that this morning. We considered last week how Joseph, having forgotten about his brothers and his family, was confronted by their presence all of a sudden. And how by his refusal to prosecute them, his refusal to have his revenge upon them, his refusal to just simply ignore them, was the beginning of him showing his mercy towards them. He had them in his hands, but didn't take advantage of the situation. As the story continues, it becomes apparent, increasingly apparent, that in his heart he has fundamentally forgiven his brothers for what they've done. He has a job to do. He has an Egypt to protect. He has no reason to trust his brothers, nor does he yet know whether he can be reconciled to them. But to begin with, as we considered last week, he decides to engage with them that he might find out whether he can be reconciled to them. Last week I put forward that you can forgive someone you have not yet been reconciled with. You can cease bearing a grudge. You can cease holding hatred for them in your heart. And you can cease being angry. regardless of whether there's any opportunity for reconciliation. Joseph is clearly open and pursues the possibility of reconciliation over many chapters. But because of what he knows about who his brothers were in the past, and who, therefore, they might still be in the present, he's going to manage that process very carefully. And looking ahead, I believe I've identified 12 ways in which Joseph manages this process. Now, we don't have time for all 12 of them this morning, but we're going to make a start considering the modes of reconciliation that Joseph demonstrates. 12 modes of reconciliation. Some of it is to do with Joseph's general posture, and some of it's to do with the way that Joseph handles his brothers, the steps that he takes. We're going to go through them roughly in the order that they appear in the story, but I'm presenting these modes of reconciliation not as an exact step-by-step guide, not as a surefire way to guarantee reconciliation in all circumstances, but features of how we might act if we were in a process of reconciliation with someone ourselves, so that we can learn from Joseph's example. Now, we have to acknowledge that the exact scenario Joseph has is unlikely to be replicated in our lives. Joseph goes from the weaker position, being persecuted by his brothers, to a position of great strength and power over them. And he has his identity hidden from his brothers. He can control the situation in ways that we won't be able to replicate. But I do hope to show that in all of this detail that we have recorded for us, we can see modes that we can adopt to help us manage a process safely, wisely, while still pursuing someone in reconciliation. As well as helping us reconcile with those who have done us wrong, my other hope as we continue through these sermons is that when we've done something wrong, when we're seeking to reconcile with someone from a position of having done them great wrong, we might be reasonable in what we expect of the person that we are trying to come back into relationship with, that we might be reasonable towards the person that we've betrayed and hurt, so that we don't make inappropriate demands or have inappropriate expectations on a person that we've done harm to, that we don't expect them to forgive and forget and be reconciled straight away. The other thing that must be acknowledged before we go further is that Joseph, from Joseph's perspective and from our perspective as readers, this is a clear-cut example. Joseph is definitely in the right. The brothers are definitely in the wrong with what they've done. The wrongdoing, the weight of it belongs with one party, and the risk of reconciliation is entirely with Joseph. Now, there are scenarios like that in life, where one party is innocent and one party is guilty. But there are other occasions where two people have done wrong to each other in hard to determine parts, who's done more wrong than the other. But I'm hoping that these principles will still help you navigate such a complex situation. And it's good to have biblical examples in mind when we get into more complex life issues. So that's some setup, hopefully that will last us for a few more weeks. We're going to plow on now. To get started, we're going to begin with the first mode that we need to be in if we're going to approach a process of reconciliation. And to begin, we'll begin with a recap. Mode of reconciliation number 1, prior forgiveness. Prior forgiveness. We've talked about how forgiveness can be done separate to reconciliation. Now that we come to an opportunity for reconciliation, before any process can be entertained, Joseph has decided to show mercy to his brothers rather than to have his revenge. In everything he is about to do, he is seeking to be reconciled to his brothers. For the Christian, This is absolutely fundamental to any process of reconciliation we might engage with. We have to be in a mode of prior forgiveness. We have to come to a table of mediation, to a first coffee after great harm, filled with love in our hearts, not hatred. If we try and reconcile with someone, saying to ourselves, well, I might reconcile with you, depending on your answers you give, but I'm still holding a grudge, and I reserve the right to withhold forgiveness if I don't like the answers I get, well, not only, as I put forward last week, would you be in contravention of the Lord's Prayer that assumes that we will forgive those who sin against us, but practically speaking, you will simply not be calm enough, loving enough, fair enough to conduct yourself in such a way that will help you do your best to help that other person reconcile with you. This does not mean that your forgiveness means that you are bound to reconcile with someone, that you must therefore enter back into close relationship with them. But my opening point is, if in your heart you're still bearing a grudge, then no amount of process, conversation, steps, mediation is likely to result in two people being reconciled. We can all think of examples where we've entered into trying to make peace in the wrong way and it hasn't helped. The great love and kindness you can show, even to your enemies, is to have forgiven them before you even start. If in your heart you still hate them and want to punish them, then out of the heart the mouth speaks. And rather than speaking words of peace to your enemy, you may well end up doing them harm rather than good. We'll continue to consider Joseph's forgiveness as we walk through the chapters, as he tries to find a way back to his brothers. He loves them. He wants to be back in relationship with them. He holds himself back for a time from throwing his arms around them. But that's his direction. His love for them demolishes any previous anger towards them. We considered forgiveness at length last week, but it's necessary as a necessary prerequisite to reconciliation this morning. Our first mode, prior forgiveness. Prior forgiveness. If you're unconvinced on this point, I'm sure it will come through as we go through the story. Ask yourself the question, could Joseph have possibly done what he does step by step if he still fundamentally bore a grudge against his brothers? So that's mode number one. That was quite a quick mode of the 12. The second mode is more complicated, zooming in on the text. It's a mode of testing. There are two different modes of testing within the list of 12. Fundamentally, Joseph cannot be in relationship with his brothers. He can't be in right relationship with his brothers if they are still the same brothers that sold him into slavery. You cannot be truly reconciled to someone. You cannot be back in relationship with someone who is going to sell you into slavery again as soon as your back is turned, who's going to stab you in the back. That's not relationship. That's not reconciliation at all. Reconciliation in that sense is a two-way street. We talked about how the forgiveness of the heart is in your control. But a process of reconciliation has to go both ways. If during the years that have passed, God has not fundamentally changed who his brothers are, then he won't ever be able to trust them when his back is turned. In the process of reconciling with someone who has done you great harm, there is a presumption that that person will have changed, or at least be trying to change. When we were reconciled with God, we turned away from our former sins in repentance so that we might walk with him in friendship. And so the person that comes to us to ask for forgiveness must be someone who has changed sufficiently that they're not going to cause us the same harm. That if it is the case that change has taken place, a new and fresh relationship can begin and continue without the burden of previous evil. But trust can't be re-established where someone shows every sign of doing the same harm again. And so behind any process of reconciliation is the presumption of change. And Joseph, though it's not his fault, it's hardly fair upon him, takes responsibility for the situation. And rather than having revenge upon his brothers, he begins a process of testing them. And in order to test for the change that he's hoping is there, he goes into a first immediate mode. And the first mode of testing, the second mode that we have for this morning, mode number 2, test the story. Test the story. Joseph deliberately tests the story that they're telling him. Now, partly this was his job as a prime minister of Egypt who had a duty to protect Egypt's citizens from people who would rob their supply of grain and to protect Pharaoh's interests. Remember, Joseph is extremely powerful, but he's still got a boss called Pharaoh. And we can see from the manner of his testing that he's also trying to see whether his brothers have changed. Let's read again from verse 9. You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land. They said to him, No, my lord, your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants have never been spies. During a time of international crisis, Joseph challenges this 10-man team from Canaan very reasonably. You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land. I discussed last week how this phrase, the nakedness of the land, refers to the idea that the 10 brothers might be coming to spot out the weak spots in Egypt's defenses or in their granary stores so that potentially a larger force could come and raid and steal the grain. Remember that the Genesis describes the whole world as being in famine and that Egypt is the only place that's got any grain left at this point. In a time of scarcity, there's much opportunity for warfare. Joseph, would have needed to watch out for that and anyone coming to buy the grain. For the first time in the story, we, the reader, know that Joseph's brothers have honest intentions. They haven't shown much honesty up until this point. But Joseph doesn't know that. And his brother's initial response cannot have filled him with hope. No, my lord, your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants have never been spies. Quite frankly, Joseph's brothers are at this very moment telling half-truths. They are saying things that Joseph knows not to be actually correct. They have come to buy food, and they are all sons of one man, but they are not honest men. And Joseph knows this. You'll remember at the beginning of the story, Joseph used to bring bad report of his brothers to his father Jacob. Joseph will have known about the story recorded in chapter 34 of Genesis. We haven't covered it in our studies. We don't have time to look at it in more detail this morning. But in chapter 34 of Genesis, the older brothers are documented as having a violent response to something that happens to their sister. One of their sisters is raped, called Dinah, and then a peace deal is brokered between the whole town that this happens with and Jacob. But his brothers act deliberately, deceitfully, so that they might kill and plunder a whole town's worth of people. Very much after the manner of spies, very much after the deceitfulness of their father Jacob. Joseph will have known about what happened there. It's not true to say that they've never been spies. It's ridiculous to suggest that they're honest men. Joseph may have surmised, I think, that his brothers would have had to have lied to his father Jacob after he was sold into slavery, so far as it's been 14 years, and Jacob has made no attempt to rescue Joseph. Given what Joseph knows and what we know of Joseph's brothers, the idea that they might be acting as spies and thieves is very plausible. Their claim to be honest men is laughable. Despite Joseph's prior forgiveness, he does not trust on face value what they have to say. Forgiveness does not mean accepting that someone is being entirely truthful with what they have to say to you now. And neither should he, given the circumstances, neither should he, considering they're obviously not actually bearing right witness about themselves, if they were to be honest. And they come to it later, don't they? They go, hang on, no, we have done evil with regards to our brother. This is why the distress is coming upon us. He doesn't trust them at face value, but at the same time, he doesn't give up at this point. He doesn't go, aha, I've caught you out, and now you're all going to jail for 14 years. He continues to engage with them rather than passing judgment upon them. He's still trying to find a way to reconcile with them. He probes again. Verse 12. He said to them, no, it is the nakedness of the land that you have come to see. And they said, we are your servants, our 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan, and behold, the youngest is this day with our father, and one is no more. But Joseph said to them, it is as I said to you, you are spies. By this you shall be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not go up from this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you, and let him bring your brother, while you remain confined, that your words may be tested, whether there is truth in you. Or else, by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies. Joseph doesn't believe them just because they repeat themselves. He is not soft on them, as it were, because of their apparent earnestness, because they're willing to make the case twice. Ultimately, their words have got very little value at this point. But instead, he tests their story. He probes until he finds a verifiable detail. A verifiable detail. He gets them to explain themselves until they give away a detail that Joseph can objectively test. If their backstory holds up, then perhaps they can show themselves to be more truthful than they used to be. And if their words can be verified, Egypt at least can begin regularly selling grain to Jacob's household. From Joseph, the official Egyptian's perspective, if they won't go and get their brother, then they are spies and they are making up an elaborate backstory and they've been caught out. From Joseph, the secret brother's perspective, with his Egypt hat off, if they are acting under Jacob's orders to come and buy grain, then there shouldn't be any problem with bringing Benjamin back with them. If not, in Joseph's mind, they will leave Simeon behind, demonstrating that they were acting nefariously and proving that they haven't changed, that they're happy to abandon a brother in order to get away, just like they gave up with Joseph. You see the first test that Joseph has set up. Furthermore, if they do bring back Benjamin, well, that means that Joseph could spend time talking to Benjamin. Now, remember that Benjamin was Joseph's younger brother. He wasn't involved in the betrayal of his older brothers. He's Joseph's only full brother, being the other son of Rachel, the favored wife of Jacob. Benjamin is an independent witness to what's happened over the last 14 years. If he can get hold of Benjamin, he can begin to verify the story of what he's being told. And if he can verify what they're telling him in the present, perhaps he can begin to start trusting them again. Begin to trust them again. Mode number 2, test the story. Now, having considered this from Joseph's story, you might well be saying, well, that's all very well for wise, quick-thinking, gifted Joseph, but how might I test the story in a situation I might find myself in? To help you understand what we've been looking at, I want you to imagine with me a more contemporary example that I hope is slightly more familiar to you, and at the same time I hope doesn't bear any resemblance to anything that's actually happened to any of you. I want you to imagine that you have a friend that you used to spend a lot of time with, that you used to share everything with, that you trusted them, that you shared food with them, that you let them stay on your couch whenever they needed to, you even let them borrow the car when they needed it. And you'd been their friend for many, many years, but after some time, you began to become worried about them. Your friend's life begins to spiral. They get involved in drink and drugs. They become more and more selfish over time. They start to borrow money off you that they start to not pay back. And they had to make use of your sofa more and more of the time. The balance of the relationship becomes more and more selfish on their part, more and more manipulative. You pleaded with them to change more than once, and they promised that they would, but things only got worse. One night, they yet again came late to crash on your sofa, and then in the middle of the night, they decide to take the cash that you've got hidden, rob you of your laptop, take the car keys, go on a reckless drive. They rack up some speeding tickets and then crash into a corner shop to rob the corner shop. And then they drive away again. And the first you hear about it is when the police knock on your door and arrest you as the owner of a vehicle, caught on camera breaking the speed limit and has been involved in a robbery. After much distress, the police let you go, and you're about to go and set out, rebuilding your life. You've lost your friend, you've no idea where they've gone. You've got a new car to buy and a new laptop to buy and no money to do it because your cash is gone. That's the beginning of the scenario. Now imagine after many years, you might, a bit like Joseph, forget the pain of the past. You might go, well, the chances are I'll never see them again. I'll try and remove the hatred, the grudge from my heart, but I'm going to try and forgive and forget by the grace of God. That's what we looked at last week. But out of the blue, for the first time in years, they turn up to church and they come over to speak to you. And they start to tell you a story of how they've changed. This is an example I'm going to keep using, and I hope to come back to. Hopefully, according to what we've looked at so far, you're already in a mode of prior forgiveness. But before you let that person back into your life, considering what they've done to you, how might you test them? How might you find out if they've actually changed? How might you find out if they've become more honest and whether there's still a risk that they might take advantage of you inappropriately again? How might you apply mode number 2, test the story? I'm going to run the scenario. They might say, I'm terribly sorry for what I've done. I've paid the price. I spent a few years in jail. I've been meaning to come back and talk to you. I'm so sorry for the way I betrayed you, but I've turned my life around now, and as soon as I can, I'm going to pay you back for everything that I stole from you. Now, this is difficult, isn't it? Because, there's the cash issue, but there's also the betrayal and the police investigation that you had to go through. You may ask, how have you changed? You always said you were going to change. How have you managed it? They might say, I don't steal anymore because I've come off the drink and off of the drugs. And you might ask, well, how have you managed that? You were always trying to quit. And they might say, Well, I've been to rehab. I've got clean. I've got a sponsor, and I go to regular meetings, and I've been clean for the last 4 years. Now, these are some good answers to some gentle questions. And if you ask such questions, you have verifiable details that you can now test. You can't test the claim on the face of it, oh, I've changed. But by asking a few more questions, you have details that you can verify. You can now ask, have you got any certificates to show that you've completed a course of rehabilitation? Can I speak to your sponsor who's been looking after you and helping you keep off the drugs? Can you show me you've been attending these AA meetings? Now, if a person won't verify their story under such circumstances, if they get intransigent, if they go, well, hang on a minute, I don't have to explain myself to you, then this might lead you to conclude that though you have forgiven them, you can't reconcile with them because you can't find any way, though you're trying your best, for them to demonstrate that they've changed and that they're being honest. You can't have a real relationship with someone who isn't willing to put any work in to make up the ground. You can't have a relationship with someone who is not being honest with you. You may forgive them, but you've got no grounds to trust them, and they are preventing the reconciliation. But if you can test their story with some hard evidence, then you might be able to begin to trust them because you might be able to build a picture of how the person has changed. Now, this level of questioning would be rude and inappropriate in normal circumstances. But what I'm hoping to show you with this long-winded example is that where there's been significant harm in the past, it is not only reasonable but necessary for us to test what is in front of us in the process of reconciliation. Rather than ignoring them or having our revenge upon them, we try and help them find a way to demonstrate that they've changed. This gives you a mechanism, a way of protecting yourself from being taken advantage of and hurt again. It's not completely preventative, but it's a step you can take to stop yourself from being hurt. It allows you to be wise as a serpent in the situation, whilst being as innocent as a dove with regards to your overall genuine desire to reconcile and your genuine desire to have forgiven them. If someone's really committed to reconciling with you, they will tell you their story and they will be keen to tell you how they've changed and they won't mind proving it. Now, what often happens is that someone in that position will say to you, well, you're a Christian. You should just forgive me and trust what I'm saying to you. Don't be so judgmental. Why should I have to prove myself to you? And I talk to people, even in the last few years of ministry, and someone's come back into their life, and the question is, well, do I believe them or not? They expect me to believe them because I'm a Christian. Unfortunately, and some of you might recognize this sort of attitude, that way of speaking is often a sign that someone is not trying to reconcile with you, they're trying to manipulate you again. And again, that's an opportunity where unfortunately you may have forgiven them, but you won't be able to have a real relationship with them because you detect that they're trying to manipulate you. Wise as serpents, innocent as doves. As Christians, we want to restore relationship with someone as quickly as possible. We are uncomfortable with enmity between brothers and sisters. As human beings, people might have done us a great deal of harm, but we might still love them. They might be a child of ours. They might be a spouse. They might be someone we've been close to all our lives. Our desire is to run back to them. Just like we see Joseph's desire is to get back to his brothers as quickly as possible. But it's really important that we test the story of someone who is asking for you to forgive them. The presumption that they have changed is a necessary prerequisite, and they need to demonstrate that to you. God ensures that we have changed before we re-enter relationship with him. He calls us to repentance. And we need to conduct our relationship after the manner of God, both in the way that we forgive, but also in the way that we ensure that we have a right and true relationship based on the truth. This does not place you in judgment over someone. This is not the same thing as saying, I'm not going to forgive you, I'm going to condemn you, I think you should be punished for what you've done, I think you should not have a relationship with me, I don't think you should have a relationship with anyone. That's not what's being said. This is not a judgment upon the person, but it is a way of assessing what somebody is saying to you so that you can see whether they're genuine. Your continued engagement with such a person is gracious, it's loving, it's merciful, it's kind. You'd be well within your rights to just ignore them and say, no, you're dead to me. To begin to take responsibility for the problems they've caused. To help them find a way of helping you trust again. This is a great love, and don't let anyone, if you're in that position of trying to reconcile with anyone, don't let anyone make you feel guilty when you're trying to show love to them and trying to help them find a way back. Early on, this is Joseph's first step. When someone's harmed you significantly, there is an opportunity for reconciliation, but you need to be as wise after the example of Joseph. Mode number 2, test the story. Of course, every scenario is slightly different. Joseph's scenario is one example. I've given another. You may need to get help testing the story. You may need somebody else to help you test the story. We're going to consider one more short mode this morning. Mode number 3 for this morning, remain flexible. Let's reread verse 18 together. On the third day, Joseph said to them, do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers remain confined where you are in custody, and let the rest go and carry grain for the famine to your households, and bring your youngest brother to me, so your words will be verified, and you shall not die. As we've just considered, in the heat of the first exchange, when Joseph is confronted by his brothers for the first time in 14 years, Joseph creates a test to test the story, and initially he invites one of them to go and get Benjamin, whilst the other 9 remain behind. Now, the main thrust of what Joseph decides to do doesn't change. But initially, this test isn't actually working. The process, we might say, has stalled. We don't know exactly why. The brothers don't go along with suggestion number 1. But presumably it's because either they are refusing to be split up in this way, or I think more likely they can't decide which one of them should be allowed to go whilst the rest of them remain. There are 3 days of stalemate. And Joseph has had some time to think, possibly pray, I would imagine. Joseph comes back to his brothers and he relaxes his test somewhat. Why does he relax his test? What does he say? In the first instance, he's saying, by the life of Pharaoh. He comes back and says, for I fear God. For I fear God. He reflects on who God is, and he adjusts. He knows that despite his own, as we've discussed, very reasonable suspicions, that they may be being honest on this occasion. And if they are being honest, in spite of who they've been in the past, Joseph realizes he cannot be unreasonable to them. He can't deal with them too harshly. Doesn't matter what they've done in the past, Joseph needs to be as fair to them as he possibly can be. So he makes it a lot easier. He decides that he can keep one of them in custody and let 9 of them go. This means that Joseph still has a hostage. This will disincentivize the brothers, if they are dishonest, from planning to raid Egypt. It's a reasonable precaution for Joseph, who is answerable to Pharaoh and who has a duty to protect the Egyptian people, but he only needs 1, he can let the other 9 go. And if they return with Benjamin, they can have Simeon back and they can have more grain. Again, we noticed in previous sermons how Joseph is very good at pragmatically finding a compromise that works between different interests. The simple point I would draw from this subtle shift in Joseph's approach is that even Joseph realizes that he is being unreasonable in his test initially, and he needs to modify it. As we approach each other in reconciliation and generally in our relationships in life, we need to be reasonable. We need to be fair. We need to make sure that we're not asking of someone something that is impossible for them to achieve, impossible for them to demonstrate. We might find that our first considered plan doesn't work. The question is, do we give up when our first proposition doesn't pay off? Or do we persevere? Do we adjust? Do we remain flexible? Going back to our example, this old friend of yours, they come to church, they tell you you've changed. And in the heat of the moment, you decide that you are going to try and reconcile with them, but you really remember how much you can't trust them. And you say, I want you to show me evidence that you have attended every single Alcoholics Anonymous meeting for the last 3 years. Now, considering what the person has done to you, doesn't seem unreasonable for that perspective, but can the person actually demonstrate that they have been to every single Alcoholics Anonymous meeting for the last 3 years? Has anyone kept a record? Is there any way of actually demonstrating it? Is it absolutely necessary that they've attended every single meeting in order to demonstrate that they're off the alcohol? If in the heat of the moment you said something like that, you may reflect over some time and have to go back to the person and say, look, actually, I'm being unreasonable. I want to be more reasonable to you because I'm remembering who God is. I want to be fair. I'm going to adjust the path so that you can come back to me because that's what I'm after. I'm going to make it easier for you. You have no right for me to make it easier for you, but I'm going to do what I can to verify your story in a way that you can actually demonstrate. You might say to your friend, perhaps instead of showing me evidence that you've been to every single meeting, could I instead speak to the person that leads the Alcoholics Anonymous meeting so they can tell me whether you've been in regular attendance? That's more achievable, that's more reasonable, and is still a beginning of a way to see whether they're being honest and see whether they're building up trust. If out of some remaining unforgiveness or over self-protection, you might be tempted to set a test for someone they cannot possibly meet. In the moment, you might think it's unfair for me to have to keep working on different ways of trying to assess the truthfulness of someone who's hurt me so badly. But if you're forgiven, if you've forgiven them, and you're committed to trying to reconcile with them, and they're trying their best to demonstrate the truthfulness of who they've become, then you need to remain in a mode of flexibility like Joseph. If you fear God, you will remember everything God did to make a way back for you. Every way he took responsibility for your sin by sending his son to die on the cross that you might have a way back. That's the standard upon which we are to look. That's the example Jesus uses of we are to see first how we have been forgiven as we approach forgiveness and perhaps reconciliation with others. So the third mode we need to adopt in any process of reconciliation, we need to remember that we are not God. We need to remain flexible. If you're going to have any hope of reconciling with someone, you're going to have to allow things to move and shift. You're going to have to allow time to consider, hang on, this isn't working, let's try something else, rather than giving up. Mode number 3, remain flexible. That's our first 3 modes and some of what we can learn from chapter 42. Now, this story goes on for several more chapters. I believe there's other things to draw out. Whether there'll be quite 9 more, I don't quite know yet. And my warning is that we don't have a complete picture of all the ways Joseph brings his brothers back and protects himself at the same time. This is an incomplete toolkit. And there are other things the Bible has to say that are outside of the story of Joseph. But I believe it's important, much like with what we were talking about on Wednesday, that before we are faced with the pressure, the emotions, the risk that comes from being confronted by someone who did us great harm in the past, we are biblically wise as to the way that we deal with that in detail. If someone's coming back to you next week and you haven't downloaded, really considered Joseph's example, then you might be ill prepared. I'm not trying to perfectly protect everyone from all harms that can ever be done. I'm not saying that you have to trust someone that you have forgiven in your heart. I'm not saying you have to reconcile with them. But most people are not coming to me or to other pastors saying, I'm a Christian and I really want to find a reason not to reconcile with this person because of the harm they've done with me. What they're often saying is, this person really, really harmed me, but despite everything, I want to reconcile with them. How do I do that safely? And I want to avoid the scenario where people come to me or to others and go, I let them back in too easily, I let them deceive me again, and I've been hurt again, and I'm no closer to being reconciled with them. So the first 3 modes I want you to consider, to chew over, to begin with. First mode, prior forgiveness. Second mode, test the story. Third mode, remain flexible. I realize that this morning has been more practical than normal. I realize that this potentially raises ongoing issues, past issues. If you need help, please do get help from someone like myself or someone you know and that you trust. If you're in the middle of something with someone at the moment, please do get help and prayer with that. There's more to go. There's no need to feel guilty for not having been as wise as Joseph in the way that you've handled such things in the past. I'm trying to help equip you for the future. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to sing, and then we're going to briefly consider communion together. Let's pray. Father God, you have called us to hard and difficult things. Lord, it is easy to love our enemies from afar. It is hard to reconcile with them. Lord, it is easier to remember the pain that others have caused than it is to remember the pain that we have caused you and that you have forgiven us for. Lord, it's easier to just let someone back in than it is to test them rightly, fairly. Lord, help us be responsible for ourselves as much as we can be. Lord, seeking to lay our lives down for one another and at the same time seeking to be wise. Lord, keep us innocent. Keep us innocent as to anger, as to hatred, as to grudge-bearing, as to unforgiveness, Lord. Help us to innocently seek to reconcile with those who have formerly done us great harm, as if they have not, and yet help us to be wise as serpents as we handle the people of this world, many of whom not only have done us harm, but want to continue to do us harm and will try and take every advantage, Lord. Father God, we are sheep amongst wolves. Lord, help us to consider rightly Joseph's example. Lord, help us to manage the relationships that we have. Lord, that we might have the outcome that Joseph has, reconciliation with his brothers. Lord, help us with that. Help us to help one another with that. Help us to be alongside our brothers and sisters who are seeking to go about this work of reconciliation. Lord, so far as it comes upon us to realize that there are people that we have not approached to try and reconcile with, people that we have done great harm to. Lord, help us to do that in the right way. Help us not to place inappropriate expectations upon people and call it Christianity. Father God, be with us, equip us, and help us in this regard, I pray. You, the great reconciling God, help us to reconcile, we pray. In your precious and holy name. Amen.